guys, it's Sam, and this is my reimagining of the Times 100 Best Fantasy Books of All Time list. Now, I've already done a video discussing my blind reaction to the list. I will link that on the screen. I encourage you to go check that one out first, because this is me discussing which books I think should have been on there that weren't, and I'm not going to be redoing the entire list and doing 100 books because that would take forever, and I actually don't believe that I have that amount of expertise to talk about every single book that I think should be on the list. But there were some on the list that I think deserve to be on the list, and I talk about that in there, but this is me elaborating on what I mentioned at the end of that video about some books that I was surprised weren't on the list and things that I felt should have been on there. So I'm going to be talking about two kind of categories of books, some that I haven't read but that I expected to be on there based on what I know about them and what the criteria was for the list, which I'll get into in a second, and then some of my own favorites that I do feel like should have been on there. So just to remind you, the Time editor said in the article that they considered each finalist, each pick that was on the list, based on key factors including originality, ambition, artistry, critical and popular reception, and influence on the fantasy genre and literature more broadly. So I'm also going to be taking those things into consideration when I'm talking about the books that I would include. So I'm not necessarily going to be telling you which books I would take off because I mentioned that more in the other video, but I will say for my reimagining of this list, like I mentioned in that video, I would make it so that you only were mentioning series, so that the same series wasn't being mentioned with multiple books. So the Game of Thrones series would be on there, but just the series. The Harry Potter series would be on there, again, just the series. Wheel of Time, things like that, instead of it being one individual book per series. I think that would end up making more room for some of these other books that I think should have been included as well, in addition to some of the books on there that I mentioned that shouldn't have been on there, in my opinion. So first I want to talk about some of the books that were the glaring omissions on the list. The one that I kept thinking of as far as middle grade books, which is actually a series that I have not read. I've read the first book in the series, but none of the rest of them, and that is the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan. I was stunned that this series was not included on the list because they had some of his Rick Riordan Presents books on the list, or at least one, and then they didn't have his. And I was like, the reason the Rick Riordan Presents books are even a thing were because Percy Jackson was so influential, so creative for the time, all of that. So to not have that influential of a series on there was a huge oversight in my opinion. Another oversight that I have read, but I wouldn't say is like the best fantasy books of all time, but I think for the fact of the reception and how it shaped the genre and how it influenced so many other books in the YA genre, it has to be on there, and that would be Twilight. I've talked at length before about how I don't think this series is good and that it's actually actively harmful, and so many people have talked about that, but I do think that for a, again, if I wouldn't necessarily frame these as best either because things are so subjective, but if you're going to say like an influential book list that shaped the genre, Twilight has to be on there. Then an author that wasn't included, and I don't know which series by her I would put on there because I haven't read all of her books, I've only read her first series, but that is Robin Hobb. I think Robin Hobb and the Percy Jackson series were the two that were mentioned the most in the comments of that video for me, that were like, how is that not on there? And I completely agreed. I said that in the first video. Robin Hobb not being on that list is an atrocity. Like, she is so influential in the genre, so just impactful, and the amount of works and how good they are. How many books are in the whole Elderling series? Like 14 or more? Like, there's so many books, and for her not to be included at all, the audacity. Since I haven't read the whole Realm of the Elderling series, I can't necessarily say which individual trilogy would be on there, but I would probably just say the Realm of the Elderling series, because it's a whole overarching series. Like, that belongs on the list. Another influential series for YA especially that wasn't on the list, that I was stunned wasn't on the list, was the Queen's Thief series by Megan Whalen Turner. I've only read the first book in this series, so again, this is in the list of like, I haven't read all of it, so I can't say exactly, but this pretty influential series, and I think recently did it just like wrap up or something, but it was one of those like original YA series that was like before its time and sort of had that upper YA feel before we had the upper YA that we have now. I just really feel like it's influenced a lot, and it wasn't there. So weird. One of my personal favorite series that wasn't included was the Graceling series by Kristen Cashore. Another like earlier YA, I think, influential series, but also incredibly creative, super well done, so many different like just types of characters and like civilizations, and the way that that villain was done was like so cool. So the fact that Graceling wasn't on there, what? Then there was some like urban and paranormal fantasy that I feel like wasn't on there. They really, like, I get that not everyone takes urban and paranormal fantasy seriously, but it is a pretty popular and influential genre, especially in the way that it has impacted TV shows, movies. I think a lot of people have read these books, and not just like your I'm a fantasy fan like type people. So the fact that like a lot of these series that I feel like some of them are like even household names weren't included. How? The big one that comes to mind, even though Anne Rice is a douchebag, is Interview with a Vampire. How? How are you not going to include like one of the like OG vampire series on this list? Like again, I definitely feel like the lack of vampires on the list was like purposeful, because vampires are such a huge part of like fantasy lore. It's like not including a wizard like series on the list. Like you're gonna include no books with wizards in them? No, of course you wouldn't, because that's like a fantasy staple. So are vampires. In the paranormal realm, and even just in other like normal high fantasy books, like vampires are present in a lot of books. The fact that you're not going to include vampire books stuns me. So Interview with a Vampire, I haven't read it, but like household name, like people that don't even read know Interview with a Vampire because of the movies. And then some other, maybe lesser known, but still pretty up there, urban fantasy series that I feel like should have been included. At least one of them would be the Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs. I feel like that's been around for a very long time. I would have loved to see the Laurel K. Hamilton, Nina Blake Vampire Hunter books, but like I don't think they're as influential and popular. I just happen to love them. But the Sookie Stackhouse series by Charlaine Harris was the True Blood. The True Blood was based on those. How are you not going to include those? Like every middle-aged mom has read those. Like they are influential. They're pretty fun. They're pretty well received actually. Like even in the like reviewing community, like until the end of the series, like they were pretty well received. So what? You are not going to include those? What? I'm going to finish up the last few series of books that I have not personally read and then get into my favorites that I think should be on the list. So the Malazan series by Steven Erikson. Again, a series that I blatantly thought was going to be on there. Like, at least one Wheel of Time book was on there by Robert Jordan, which, like, I don't care about that series. I don't love it, but, like, you can't argue that it's not influential. So, like, that was on there, and I would include the whole series on the list. Malazan wasn't on there, and that's, like, one of these series. Like, if we're talking about, like, the series that, like, every fantasy gatekeeper white boy in his basement is talking about, it's Malazan. And like there's a reason, like I'm sure Malazan is very good, I just don't have any interest in reading it, but like Malazan should have been on the list. Like it is again incredibly influential, like dipping into that kind of like grimdark and all of that, and like very expansive, like creative it sounds like. The fact that Malazan wasn't on there, I, again, stunned. And then I was also expecting some more grimdark. I actually thought that The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, or Joe Abercrombie like somewhere, would have been on the list. That series should have been on the list. Like, as far as grimdark has gotten very popular, at least within the last 10 years, for sure, if not more. There should have been some grimdark series on the list. My personal favorite is the Mark Lawrence Book of the Ancestor series, but The Blade Itself should have been on there. Like, that one is, again, pretty wildly popular. I know that I'm saying a lot of popularity stuff. I know that it's not just about popularity and influence, but like those two things usually happen when the book is also creative and all the other things that they said, like, you know, original things that they said on the list were like factors as well. So I keep repeating influential and popular because those kind of encompass those other traits typically as well. So I just want to let you know that those are kind of like a given with what I'm talking about. And the last series that I was a little shocked wasn't on there, as much as I loathe to admit it, is like something by Sarah J Maas, like either Throne of Glass or the A Court of Thorns and Roses series. Probably more Throne of Glass, but the reason for this, again, is because I feel like it's a powerhouse in the YA genre, and I feel like it really brought, like, Fae back in. Like, I know, I also am a little shocked that, like, some Holly Black of some kind wasn't on there, or, like, what was it, like, the Iron Fae series with, like, Julie Kagawa. I was surprised that neither of them were on there as well. I would mention that, but I would say that at this point, they were almost like, you know, they walked so Throne of Glass could run. They are less like universally well known. Like I really feel like the Sarah J Maas books are read by people that are like even like non-readers, you know what I mean? And I think she like made Fae popular again, even though they're not the Fae that like everybody really loves. Again, we have all these things. I know I'm not like a huge Sarah J Maas fan, but I really felt like that series, at least one of her should have been on there. Now moving on to some of my personal faves that were on the list. First, the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. The audacity. I get that this series isn't necessarily like as broadly popular, but I do feel like it's indicative of the rise in Eastern European inspired fantasy books, and it is really original, super well done, award-winning, all these things that like should have made it on a best of list, in my opinion. Then, The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. Come on. Like, again, similar to some of these other series that I mentioned, like, this is an iconic series. You know, it's up there with like The Name of the Wind and some of these other books and like Game of Thrones, where people are like, when is the next book coming out? You know, so really? And again, well done. Super like inventive and creative, and I just it's a good book. It's a good series. It's a great series. I would say it's like one of the defining fantasy series, like more modern fantasy. What is going on with this list? Not a personal favorite of mine yet, because I've only read the first book in the series, but a lot of people mentioned Stormlight Archives. So I was a little surprised that Stormlight wasn't on there. Mistborn was, and I would have, again, just included Mistborn series on there, but I think Stormlight is different enough from Mistborn that I was a little shocked that wasn't on there as well. The Abhorsen series by Garth Nix, another one of my personal favorites. Again, an OG YA. Like, there was so much, you know, slighting of the OG YA that I was very shocked. But this is one of the groundbreakers, and especially for darker fantasy with necromancy that is so popular right now. Where was it? I also would maybe, but yeah, I would probably put Daughter, Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor on the list as well. Like, this series. I think as far as like an Angels and Demon type series, which is like pretty influential, her writing is just, again, extra points for like originality and just like beauty. Like that, she just should have been on there. Like the Wayward Children novella series, I was a little surprised wasn't on there. Now granted, it might have been because they are novellas and maybe they were saying like we're only doing novels or whatever, but this novella series I feel like is so, again, like rich and imaginative and award-winning and just very, very good as far as all the different worlds and all the different, like, it is that quintessential, it's portal fantasy, so not enough portal fantasy was on there, number one, and then it's portal fantasy with all these different like fantasy tropes that sort of like encompasses all of fantasy in this one series, and it wasn't on there. A similar vibe to that is the Magicians series by Lev Grossman, the Magicians trilogy. Again, a series that like is very meta about fantasy and turns a lot of fantasy tropes on its head, and it wasn't on there. And it's a series that has its own TV series, which again, not everyone likes, but like, you're not gonna include the Magicians? Like, a series that talk about fantasy, especially on best of lists, is kind of like, what, like, it does everything. It does everything. How are you not gonna include that? And last but not least, one of my final favorite YA series is the Witchland series by Susan Dennard. I just think this is so inventive and expansive, and again, will have like long-term staying power that I was shocked it wasn't mentioned. This is like a step above so much that's happening in fantasy in the last few years, in YA fantasy. So give it the credit that it is due. So yeah, that is it for my reimagined list. I know I didn't include like a whole brand new list, but I'm definitely not going to do that. I have some humility, unlike the people at times who, like, I realize I'm not an expert in fantasy. I know a lot. I'm pretty in it, in the community and stuff, but like, I haven't read everything, you know? But I would make better choices than they did. No tea, no shade, but also all TL shade. So comment below and talk to me some more about some of your choices. A lot of you talked to me in the comments of that video, but let me know what you think of like my reimagined list, if I forgot anything. I didn't mention some like older fantasy because there's so many like classics, you know, Alice in Wonderland and Peter Pan and like some of this kind of stuff. Treasure Island, well no, Treasure Island I guess wouldn't be fantasy, I don't know. But some of those I didn't really want to include because I'm not super well versed in some of those, but definitely let me know about some of those that you feel like should have been on the list. So thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.